We should all be worried about the worsening human rights situation in India.
Those who are not Hindu and particularly Christians are facing growing intolerance.
We as a Christian community can respect other faiths and identities. We must ask our partners to do the same.
And it is our duty to make sure that they stop, also in Manipur.
The European Union is back in the news. Last week, they were lecturing India on human rights. They were debating the situation in Manipur. And look what they're doing now. Hiring a bouncer. You heard that right. The European Union has hired a bouncer, the kind you see at clubs or bars. Just one difference though. This bouncer is not a human being. It's an entire country. This one, Tunisia. It's a country in northern Africa. It's a jumping point for migrants traveling to Europe. This map should help you understand. If you take a boat from Tunisia to Italy, it's 600 kilometers. So migrants from Africa often gather in Tunisia, and from here, they cross over to Italy. But Europe wants to stop this migration. So what are they doing? On Sunday, 3 European leaders flew down to Tunisia. EU Chief Ursula von der Leyen, Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, and the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte. They held talks with the Tunisian president and signed a deal. Now, the EU is calling it a comprehensive strategic partnership, but let's call it what it is, a bouncer for hire. Tunisia has agreed to strengthen its borders, to basically stop migrants from leaving for Europe. And what do they get in return? Money, a lot of it. EU leaders have promised more than $1 billion in aid. The specifics are not out, but you get the idea of this transaction. Europe pays Tunisia to keep migrants out. They don't want to get their hands dirty. Mighty Europe cannot round up and deport helpless people. That would be a human rights violation. So instead, they're outsourcing the job. They're asking Tunisia to do it. On paper, Brussels has refuted this charge. The EU president says it's all about tackling smuggling.
We need to crack down on criminal networks of smugglers and traffickers. They are exploiting human despair, and we have to break their reckless business model. So we will work with Tunisia on an anti-smuggling operational partnership.
How noble of Europe. They're not keeping migrants out, they're just concerned for their safety. Let's not kid ourselves here. The problem is not smuggling or trafficking. The problem here is race. Europe had no issues welcoming refugees from Ukraine. Around 8 million of them are registered in the EU. 8 million in just 500 days. Compare this to the numbers from Africa. Italy has reported, in fact, 75,000 migrants in 6 months. I'm not saying welcome all of them. After all, these are migrants, these are not refugees, so Europe can choose to resettle them or not. I'm saying be consistent. Practice what you preach about human rights. Do not outsource your crackdowns to other countries, because that's exactly what Europe has done. Tunisia may be a democracy on paper, but their president has a problematic track record. He's jailed critics and journalists. He's increased the powers of his office, and he's also reduced the parliament to a rubber stamp. What has the EU said about all of this? Well, in 2021, they had a lot to say. The European Parliament accused Tunisia of cracking down on freedoms. But I guess that's all in the past. Under this deal, Tunisia will take back only their migrants, meaning Tunisians. What about the rest? People from all over Africa and even Asia gather here to migrate. Take a look at what Tunisia does to them.
In Tunisia, the police arrested us, beat us, and took our phones and all our money. They told us to go to Libya, and my people kept saying that Libya is very bad, but they left us without food and water. They put us there and then left.
As we tried to enter the Tunis again, they now beat us badly. They now broke this my hand, or my head. They now tear it. That's what happened.
So that's what Tunisia does to migrants, and pretty soon they will get paid for it. $1 billion check to keep migrants out of Europe. The UK is doing something similar. They signed a special deal with Rwanda. Under this deal, the UK would send asylum seekers to Central Africa. Rwanda would host them. In return, the British government agreed to pay the Rwandan government. It was so cruel, even British courts disagreed. They called it unlawful. Now imagine if some other country had done this, say in Asia, or in Latin America, the criticism would have been unrelenting. The European Parliament would have debated it. But now there is silence, not a word of criticism against this racist policy. And that's what it is, racist. EU chief Ursula von der Leyen called it shared prosperity. What exactly are they sharing? Most of Africa was colonized by Europe. Their plunder and persecution is partly responsible for Africa's troubles today. If anything, Europe should be paying reparations. They should take in more people. Instead, they've hired a bouncer. Next time Europe lectures someone, remember this deal. Just point them towards Tunisia. Our next story is from Pakistan. I will begin with two separate incidents. One is this, a temple being demolished in the city of Karachi. But this isn't just any other temple. It's a 150-year-old Mari Mata temple. So historically and culturally significant. But when has that even mattered in Pakistan? Anyway, the demolition happened last week. That too in the middle of the night. It happened almost like a covert operation. Residents say there was no electricity in the area. The bulldozers came in the middle of the night. Even a police vehicle was giving them cover. They razed the entire structure. Only the outer walls and main gate were left intact. And just like that, a 150-year-old temple was reduced to dust. And that's just one incident. The second one was in the Sindh province. Again, a temple attack. This one was located in the Kashmir area of Sindh. But this time it was not razed by authorities. This time the temple was attacked by rocket launchers. Imagine that. A place of worship being hit by rocket launchers. And this was a small temple built by the Hindu community in the area. Some 8 to 9 gunmen were involved in the attack. They fired rocket launchers at the temple, but these failed to explode. So thankfully no one was harmed. They continued until the police reached the spot. So we have one temple demolition in Karachi and another horrific attack in the Sindh province. What explains these sudden attacks? What is the reason behind this rising anti-Hindu sentiment in Pakistan? The answer may be a little closer home. Some of you may have heard of her, Seema Haider. She's a Pakistani mother of 4, but her story is an interesting and bizarre one. She left Pakistan to run away to India. Why? Because apparently she'd fallen in love with a Hindu man here. Sounds like a cross-border love story. Authorities say there may be more to it. But this is where things get weird. Seema apparently met this man while playing the popular game PUBG in 2019. So she escaped to India via Nepal. Soon they settled near the capital, Delhi. Earlier this month, she was arrested for illegally entering India without a visa. Her lover, on the other hand, was jailed for sheltering illegal immigrants. Now we understand they're out of jail, but it looks like the story did not go down too well with Pakistan. Groups threatened to attack Hindus and their places of worship there. They said it was in retaliation to the so-called love story. So that could be one reason. But then again, with Pakistan, you never really know. It's not like they have a history of protecting minorities. Look at this report by the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan. It talks about the recent attacks. Let me quote from what it says. Alarmed by reports of deteriorating law and order in the districts of Kashmir and Ghotki in Sindh, where some 30 members of the Hindu community, including women and children, have allegedly been held hostage by organized criminal gangs. Hindu women and children being held hostage, all because some people did not fancy a cross-border love story. And this is not a first. Hindus are the largest minority community in Pakistan. Nearly 7.5 million Hindus live in the country. Most of them live in the Sindh province. This region has a rich Hindu history, but it's now making news for discrimination and persecution. Since 2020, more than 20 Hindu temples have been attacked in Pakistan. They were either vandalized or damaged. There are reports of forced conversions, kidnapping of Hindu girls and women, forced marriages, rapes, even beheadings. They are marginalized and targeted every day. And what does the government of Pakistan do? Absolutely nothing. Hindus may make up the biggest minority community, but there are no laws protecting them. In fact, there are no laws protecting minorities in Pakistan. When Pakistan was formed in the year 1947, its founder Muhammad Ali Jinnah gave a speech. It was a speech on religious freedom. He said that anyone is allowed to worship anywhere in the country, temples, mosques, or any other place of worship. 75 years later, Temples are being attacked by rocket launchers in the same Pakistan. Do you know what's trending today? The boom in India's stock markets. The bulls are leading the way. Key indices are breaking records. We'll discuss all of it later in the show. But first, we want to tell you who may be feeling left out. China. Once the engine of the global economy, China today is a laggard. Its economy is pulling down global growth. And it's not just China's problem, it's your problem too, because Beijing's poor economic performance has a bearing on all of us. Tonight, we bring you the numbers, the trends, and the implications, starting with the latest set of data. Today's headlines featured Evergrande. It's a Chinese property giant. It has been in news for all the wrong reasons lately. Today, it reported more losses. We are talking about losses worth $81 billion. $81 billion in 2 years. Evergrande has been in financial trouble for a while now. The company lost $66 billion in 2021 and another $15 billion in 2022. It defaulted 2 years ago. Before that, it was China's biggest developer. Today, it is one of China's worst debtors. By last year, the company owed some $340 billion. Since 2021, Evergrande had not released its financials. Today, they finally did. And it revealed how deep the rot is. The fall of Evergrande triggered a major churn in China. It inflicted some serious pain, and it had a ripple effect on China's property sector, on its banks, and on its economy. 50 developers defaulted after Evergrande, and since the Evergrande collapse, China has been stumbling from one problem to another. Yesterday, they released the latest economic data. China's economy grew by just 6.3%. It doesn't sound like a very bad figure, but it's slower than what had been expected. China's exports fell by 12% last month. Sale of flats down by 27%. These are poor numbers. They suggest that China's economic growth has stagnated. Although yesterday Beijing tried to put a different spin. They tried to push a different narrative. Listen to this.
Although the Chinese economy faces increasingly complex and challenging external environment and domestic development pressures, its fundamental strengths and its advantages characterized by resilience, great potential and vitality remain unchanged for the long term.
There are challenges, but the economy will recover. That's the message from Beijing. China is making it sound like there is no reason to worry. But behind the scenes, Chinese officials have gone into an overdrive. They're talking to the US again. In 1 month, China has hosted 3 senior American officials. In the next 2 weeks, Chinese ministers will travel to Washington. And guess what's on the agenda? Trade ties. Plus, China's premier is making fresh overtures. Recently, Li Qiang addressed business leaders. His message to them was simple. China is open for business.
For the whole year, we are expected to achieve the target of about 5% economic growth set at the beginning of this year. Recently, some international organizations and institutions have also raised their forecasts for China's economic growth this year, showing their confidence in China's development prospects.
This was last month. Now the numbers are out and they're well below China's targets. This year, Beijing wanted to grow at 5%. But from April to June, China's economy grew by just 0.8%, which is less than the 1% mark. At this pace, Beijing is sure to miss its targets, and it seems to be asking for help. This week, there is another important meeting. China has invited some of the world's biggest investors. And who will meet them? China's financial regulators. The goal is to seek investments. And who is going to attend the meeting? Well, mostly fund managers from large private equity firms, also some representatives from sovereign wealth funds. There is no official guest list, so it remains to be seen who will finally turn up. But here's the bigger question. Can Investor Summit solve China's problems? Experts don't think so, because China's economic problems are more fundamental in nature. The debt levels are way too high, more than 250% of the GDP. That's higher than even the US. There is weakness in real estate, unemployment is high, and sanctions from the West are forcing businesses to take their investments elsewhere. These factors are exerting pressure on the Chinese economy. Until Beijing fixes these problems, there can be no recovery. Now let's turn our focus to Afghanistan, where the Taliban look like they're actually up to something good. Last year, they banned the cultivation of poppy. That's the crop used to make the drug heroin. It was a major source of income for Afghan farmers, also a major source of funding for the Taliban. But they banned it. Now, on the face of it, the move seems like a rare positive by the Taliban, but the West is not happy with it. They're now raising an alarm over the shortage of the drug. Not making this up. Some in the West do not want this poppy ban to continue because this could lead to problems on Western shores. Our next report explains.
The Taliban are in the middle of a war. Not the usual kind though. It's their version of a war on drugs. You see, Afghanistan is the world's heroin basket. For years it has produced over 80% of the world's heroin. But last year, the Taliban put a ban on poppy cultivation. Poppy is the crop that is eventually turned into opium and then heroin. It was grown throughout Afghanistan, especially in the west and southwest. Nowadays, you see headlines about the Taliban burning down fields of the crop. Now you'd think this was a good thing. The women-hating tribal warlords finally doing something good for a change. But it seems that the West isn't too happy about this move. Take a look at these headlines. The first article talks about how the Taliban's successful opium ban is bad for Afghans and the world. Yes, really. It's by the United States Institute of Peace. The organization is an independent institute founded by the US Congress, and it warns about the dangers of less opium in the world. Let's first look at some of the points raised. It says that poppy farming has helped Afghan farmers survive the chaos the country regularly goes through, that forcing them to move to other crops would bring more hardship to the small-scale farmers. It would also widen existing inequalities. Rich farmers could hoard opium harvests and sell the crop at a higher rate when supplies dry up. The poor farmers will be at risk. They could resort to selling assets like livestock to make ends meet, leading to ruin in the long run. This sounds like a humane argument. It considers the plight of poor Afghan farmers. But let's look at the other side. Almost 3.5 million Afghans are addicted to opium in some form or the other. That's about 10% of the population. The drug is wrecking lives, more so since the Taliban took over in 2021. After all, a lot of people turned to drug abuse to cope with the horror of the Taliban's return. So while the plight of the farmers is important, opium may not be the best way to support their welfare. The other arguments raised against an opium ban in the USIP article and others don't really focus on Afghans. They're about what will happen to the West. An opium and heroin ban will reduce the supply of the drugs in Europe because most of Afghanistan's heroin makes its way to Europe via Iran, Turkey and then the Balkans. The relative ease of heroin access actually shields Europe from worse narcotics. From synthetic opioids like fentanyl. That's a drug leaving a trail of bodies in the US. It's reportedly 50 times stronger than natural heroin. Europe has managed to stay relatively fentanyl-free for now. The end of Afghan opium could change that, bring about a worse drug crisis in Europe. Now you can still justify this fear. While not brave or ideal, countries are of course allowed to prioritize the lives of their citizens over foreigners. But the other reasons given are less about life and more about comfort, the fear of immigrants. Once again, Europe wants to keep refugees away. Afghan refugees this time. The articles against the opium ban warn of a new exodus from Afghanistan, of farmers who lose their livelihoods coming to seek asylum in Europe, and for that the solution seems to be letting them continue farming poppy. It's ridiculous. How can the West be so xenophobic that they would prefer more drug production in the world over accepting refugees? How can they advocate just letting Afghans make more heroin instead of making room for refugees looking for a better life? The ending of Afghan opium should be celebrated. Any short-term difficulties the people face should be addressed through aid. For once, the Taliban seem to be on the right track. This should be encouraged. Because look at the alternative. The Taliban have historically depended on heroin for funding. And if they cannot feed the Afghan people, if they face too much public anger, they might just restart poppy cultivation. Then xenophobic Westerners may sign relief, but Afghans and the rest of the world will continue to suffer from a drug crisis.
In Singapore, a love affair has turned into a national scandal. This is in their parliament. Before we tell you about it, some context. Singapore is known for its extremely clean politics. So much so that at one time parliamentarians would dress only in white clothes to show people that they were quote-unquote whiter than white. But now some dirt has just tarnished this squeaky clean image. An affair has led to the resignation of 2 parliamentarians. Again, when we think of reasons for politicians resigning, an affair would not be too high on the list. But in this case, it's being called the biggest political challenge for the ruling party in 40 years. And it has caused quite a quake in the tranquil world of Singaporean politics. Here's a report.
There's a political scandal rocking Singapore. The island nation just saw 2 parliamentarians resign. One of them is this man, Tan Chuan Jin. Until yesterday, he was Singapore's Speaker of Parliament. The other person to resign was Cheng Li Hui. She had been a member of Parliament since 2015. The reason for their resignation was that they were having an affair. The Parliament Speaker is married with 2 children. In his resignation letter, he wrote, "For me personally, this recent episode has added to the hurt I have caused my family. I have let them down. We have spoken about my personal conduct before. There are areas where I have fallen short. I need to take responsibility for them and help heal my family." The letter was addressed to Singapore's Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong. Notice how he wrote that he had spoken about his personal conduct before. The affair was reportedly going on for years. The Prime Minister was aware of it as far back as 2020, but only now was the Speaker asked to resign. The timing could be related to another gaffe by Tan. He was recently caught bad-mouthing another lawmaker in Parliament. Tan had forgotten to switch off his mic, and his tirade against a lawmaker became public. However, Lee says it's the affair that resulted in Tan's ouster.
Besides Mr. Tan's recent hot mic incident, the unparliamentary language which was used, there's also the relationship of the inappropriate relationship between him and his fellow PAP MP, Ms. Cheng Li Hui. This is, in comparison, I think the more serious matter, because he was a speaker and she is an MP, and there should not have been a relationship.
In Singapore, affairs regularly lead to disqualification. It happened in 2012 as well. The then Speaker of the House, Michael Palmer, also resigned over an affair. At the time, the Prime Minister said it was the proper thing to do. The then Deputy Prime Minister, Teo Chee Han, said, "MPs have a duty to the public which they can only perform if they do not mix up their personal and official relationships." There have been other affairs that led to resignations as well. In 2016, an MP from the ruling party, David Ong, resigned over a personal indiscretion. Anytime such indiscretions become public, the MPs are shown the door. So once again, the Speaker of Parliament was asked to step down over an affair. The Speaker. It's one of the highest-ranking roles in Singapore's government. The Speaker is third in line for the presidency in the country. It's not just anyone who can become Speaker. They are directly appointed by the Prime Minister. This means Tan was seen as competent. So how does an affair lead to his removal? In most of the world, affairs aren't the worst offence committed by politicians, not by a long shot. Think Boris Johnson, Bill Clinton, John F. Kennedy, Jacques Chirac, Nicolas Sarkozy and François Hollande. The list goes on. In fact, it's more common to see struggles to remove politicians implicated in insurrections. So why do Singapore's politicians adhere to such a strict moral code? In part, it's due to the country's history with corruption. Singapore was a British colony till 1965. Before that, it was occupied by Japanese forces during World War II. Both colonizers left a legacy of corruption in governance, and when the country became independent, the government led by Lee Kuan Yew was determined to uproot corruption. And he succeeded. Singapore has regularly been considered as the sole Asian nation free of corruption. This reputation has allowed his party to dominate Singapore's politics. The People's Action Party has governed the island nation continuously since even before the country became independent. Party members were known to wear white shirts and trousers to showcase their clean image. They were supposed to be whiter than white, holier than thou. It's a legacy the party cherishes. It's also a political ploy, banking on their clean image to win elections. So that's why anytime something like an affair becomes public, the offenders are ousted, irrespective of their qualifications. But that's the thing, even if people are morally grey, is it the party's place to intervene? Moral dubiousness at home doesn't mean they are bad at governance. It's a personal matter. Should Singapore's elected officials be wasting their time with family therapy sessions? Or leave it to the families to sort out their problems and let the government stay just focused on governance?
Now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. China has been hit by Typhoon Talim. Heavy rain created a waterfall on a busy road. Meanwhile, wildfires are burning in parts of California and the United States. We'll show you a time-lapse video of its progression. And Indian cricketer Mahendra Singh Dhoni is famous for his decision-making prowess on the field, but you know he's also a huge bike and car enthusiast. Former Indian cricketer Venkatesh Prasad shared a video of Dhoni's impressive automobile collection. And finally, we're taking you back in history on this day. In 1947, the Indian Independence Act was cleared by the British monarchy. This act divided the subcontinent. It created two new independent nations, India and Pakistan. It also declared India as a sovereign and independent state. We're leaving you with that. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Any comments on this?
Unless and until someone is mad about this, you can't.
I'll take a video.
Isn't it? Huh? She was not making it for me. Doesn't it look weird? All these पता नहीं ये बाइक शोरूम हो सकता है ये. इसीलिए जब ये बन रहा था ना तो हम लोग बहुत बड़ा था.
Yeah, it's full. It's full.